It was supposed to be a quiet night out, just two brothers sitting at a bar after weeks of grueling undercover work. The twins, both seasoned FBI agents, had spent months infiltrating criminal networks, living double lives under assumed identities. They were trained to remain calm under pressure, to blend in, to read the room before acting. But that evening, they weren't on duty, at least not officially. They were just two black men enjoying a drink in a downtown bar, unaware that within minutes, their expertise in handling high-pressure situations would be tested in the most personal way imaginable. The tension started small, a few suspicious glances, a bartender whispering to a police officer standing near the entrance. The brothers noticed it but brushed it off. After years in law enforcement, they knew the look of quiet unease that sometimes followed them in certain spaces. Still, when two uniformed officers approached their table, the twins exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. The officers didn't ask many questions at first. One of them gestured for the men to stand, his tone clipped and authoritative. "We've had reports about some suspicious individuals matching your description," he said. The words were sharp, laced with assumption rather than evidence. The twins remained composed, asking calmly what the issue was, but their politeness only seemed to fuel the officers' irritation. Within seconds, hands were on their wrists. Cold metal clamped around their skin, and the unmistakable click of handcuffs echoed through the bar. The entire place fell silent. A dozen cell phones raised to capture the scene. The twins didn't resist, not because they were guilty, but because they knew how quickly things could spiral out of control when emotions took over. They had seen enough cases where escalation led to tragedy, and the irony wasn't lost on them that they were now living the same narrative they had investigated countless times. The officers continued their questioning, speaking over the twins' attempts to identify themselves. "Keep your hands where I can see them," one shouted, though their hands were already cuffed. The bar patrons watched in uneasy silence, some whispering, some nodding, as if to say they'd seen this story before. The twins' calm demeanor was almost unnerving to the officers, who seemed determined to interpret composure as defiance. In their training, the brothers had studied the psychology of bias, how unconscious assumptions could shape perception, how authority mixed with fear often produced disastrous outcomes. Yet knowing the theory didn't make living through it any easier. One of the brothers tried again, this time using a firmer tone. "You're making a mistake," he said. "We're federal agents. Check our badges." His voice didn't waver, but the officers laughed dismissively. "Yeah, sure you are," one replied, tightening the grip on his arm. The humiliation cut deeper than the physical discomfort. They were used to danger, but this was different. This wasn't an ambush by criminals. It was a betrayal by the very institution they had dedicated their lives to protecting. The tension escalated when one officer reached into the twins' jackets, searching for identification. When his hand brushed against the edge of a concealed firearm, he froze. The next few seconds unfolded in chaos, shouting commands to stay still. The metallic sound of additional weapons being drawn. The twins, despite their training, could feel their hearts racing. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and everything could end in a second. They repeated their warning. "We're FBI agents. The firearm is gun. Our credentials are in the left pocket." The officer hesitated, pulling out a leather badge holder and flipping it open. The gold emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed under the dim bar lights. For a moment, the entire scene froze in disbelief. The realization hit the officers like a punch. They had just handcuffed two undercover federal agents, both of whom outranked them in authority, and experienced the silence that followed was heavier than the chaos that preceded it. One officer stammered an apology, trying to justify his actions. "We were just responding to a call," he said, his voice unsteady. But excuses couldn't undo what had happened. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, aware they had witnessed something raw and revealing, not a misunderstanding, but a mirror reflecting the deeper truth about systemic bias. The twins didn't shout, didn't lash out. They simply looked at the officers, their expressions unreadable but their eyes filled with a quiet, burning disappointment. In that moment, they embodied the conflict of loyalty and disillusionment that many black law enforcement officers carried within them, a constant, balancing act between duty to the badge and awareness of the prejudice that came with their skin. When the cuffs were finally removed, the metal left faint red marks around their wrists. One of the brothers rubbed his arm, not from pain, but from disbelief. They knew procedures, knew that sometimes mistakes happened in the field. But this wasn't a procedural error. It was a manifestation of something far older and more insidious. They had been judged, not by their actions or their conduct, but by their appearance. The officers, still shaken, tried to recover the situation by offering clumsy apologies and insisting that no harm was intended. But intention didn't erase impact. The twins could see the nervousness in their eyes, the dawning realization that this incident could end careers, spark investigations, and become a headline as word spread. Senior officials were called in. The bar that had once been filled with casual conversation was now a scene of official statements, witness interviews, and tension so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. The twins remained composed through it all, knowing that any emotional reaction could be misinterpreted as aggression. They had been trained to control their expressions, to maintain composure even when the situation was unjust. Yet beneath that calm surface, a storm brewed: frustration, sadness, and a deep weariness that came from realizing how easily they had become targets despite their badges. Their service, their years of dedication to justice. When the FBI field supervisor arrived, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The local officers straightened their posture, suddenly aware of the gravity of their mistake. The supervisor's tone was icy but controlled as he demanded an explanation. The officers stumbled through their version of events, trying to justify the arrest as a case of mistaken identity based on a vague report. The supervisor listened silently before turning to the twins. The look in his eyes wasn't just professional concern, it was personal outrage. He had seen bias play out before, but rarely so blatantly and so publicly. The incident would be logged, reviewed, and investigated. But the emotional damage couldn't be undone. The twins left the bar quietly that night, walking side by side down the dimly lit street. They didn't speak for several minutes, both lost in their thoughts. They knew this story would spread within the bureau, within law enforcement circles, and across social media. They also knew what it symbolized. They had lived through countless briefings about community trust and accountability, but nothing drove the message home like personal experience. The incident would become a case study in bias, not just for the police department involved, but for agencies across the country. It would serve as a painful reminder that even those who enforce the law are not immune to the assumptions that shape perception. For the twins, it wasn't just about being handcuffed, it was about what those cuffs represented: the invisible restraints of prejudice that still lingered in the very systems meant to uphold justice. The aftermath of the incident rippled through the police department like an earthquake, shaking the foundations of trust, professionalism, and accountability that law enforcement claimed to uphold. What began as a routine patrol response had exposed something far deeper, a reflexive bias that guided decisions even before facts were established. The image of two black men in a bar had triggered suspicion, and the assumption of criminality had taken over logic. Once it became public knowledge that those men were undercover FBI agents, the narrative shifted from routine policing to national controversy. Internal investigations were launched immediately, not only to determine procedural errors but to address the unspoken truth that bias had played a pivotal role in the officers' judgment. Within the department, whispers filled the halls. Some officers defended their colleagues, saying they were just doing their jobs, while others admitted privately that the incident was an embarrassment they couldn't justify for years. Discussions about racial profiling had circled law enforcement agencies, but rarely did an incident hit so close to home. The FBI itself took the event seriously, recognizing that it highlighted the same systemic issues they often investigated in local departments. Meetings were called between federal and local officials to assess what went wrong, and the conclusions were uncomfortable. Training programs had failed to address implicit bias effectively, and cultural attitudes within certain precincts still equated suspicious with black. The two agents who had been handcuffed remained professional throughout, cooperating with the internal review but refusing to let the issue be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. They had seen too many cases end with excuses and no change, and they were determined that this would not become another forgotten headline. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with outrage as the video footage surfaced, showing two calm, restrained men being treated like criminals. News outlets dissected every frame, commentators debated the implications, and civil rights groups seized on the story as proof that systemic racism was not a relic of the past, but an ongoing crisis. For many viewers, the shock wasn't just in seeing police detain black men, it was realizing those men were law enforcement officers themselves. It shattered the illusion that a badge could shield someone from bias. If even FBI agents could be profiled and humiliated in public, what did that mean for ordinary citizens with no authority, no credentials, no institutional power behind them inside the police department? Morale plummeted, officers felt the pressure of public scrutiny, and the leadership struggled to maintain composure in front of cameras and microphones. The chief held press conferences emphasizing commitment to transparency and accountability. But the community wasn't easily convinced. Local activists demanded the suspension of the officers involved, while others called for broader reforms, including mandatory bias training and community oversight boards. The department's reputation took a hit that would take years to rebuild. Within the ranks, there was resentment too. Some officers felt unfairly targeted by the backlash, while others began quietly acknowledging that something truly was broken in their approach to policing. The debate split the department down the middle, forcing individuals to confront where they stood in a system built on authority yet riddled with prejudice. The twins themselves became reluctant symbols of change. They didn't seek the spotlight, but their story became a rallying point for advocates of police reform and racial justice. They were invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, universities, and community events, not as victims, but as professionals who had experienced the system from both sides. Their insights were uncomfortable but necessary. They spoke about how bias wasn't always overt, how it hid beneath layers of procedure and language, manifesting in the split-second assumptions officers made in the field. They explained that training alone wasn't enough. What was needed was cultural transformation. Accountability that didn't just punish mistakes, but prevented them from happening in the first place. Their words resonated deeply, not just because of their authority as FBI agents, but because their story represented a lived truth that no statistic or policy report could capture. The department launched its internal review, bringing in external consultants and federal advisors to ensure neutrality. The process was rigorous, examining every decision, every report, and every officer involved. It became clear that the issue wasn't isolated. Similar incidents had occurred before, though most never reached public attention. This time, however, the visibility of the case forced genuine introspection. Supervisors began to reconsider their approach to training and supervision, realizing that compliance checklists weren't enough to change attitudes. Workshops on cultural awareness were introduced. Body camera footage was used in new training modules to highlight moments where bias could influence behavior, and community liaisons were appointed to rebuild public trust. It was a start, but change was slow. Resisted by those who felt accused rather than enlightened within the FBI, the incident sparked its own set of reflections. The Bureau had long prided itself on discipline and equality within its ranks, but the twins' experience raised uncomfortable questions about how federal agents interacted with local departments, especially when race was a factor. Interagency relations grew tense in the weeks that followed, as both sides tried to navigate the delicate balance between cooperation and accountability. The FBI's director issued a statement emphasizing the need for respect among all law enforcement bodies, subtly underscoring that professionalism must transcend prejudice. Behind closed doors, however, there was frustration. Many agents of color spoke up, sharing their own experiences of being profiled or doubted even while wearing the badge. The twins' story had become a catalyst, emboldening others to speak truths long silenced by fear of retaliation or disbelief. Media coverage persisted for months, dissecting every angle of the event. Some commentators tried to frame it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a product of miscommunication, but those who looked deeper saw a pattern too familiar to ignore. The officers' actions had been shaped by a narrative that associated blackness with danger, regardless of context. The fact that these men were agents, professionals, trained to de-escalate and protect, didn't matter in that moment. All the officers saw were two men who didn't look like they belonged. The public discourse expanded beyond the bar, beyond the department, into a national conversation about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets the handcuffs in private moments. The twins reflected on how surreal it all was. They had spent their careers investigating corruption, tracking organized crime, protecting national security, and yet the battle they were now fighting was one they could never have imagined. A fight for dignity within their own profession. They didn't want vengeance or public sympathy. What they wanted was recognition that the system needed change. They worked quietly with justice reform advocates to propose new policies focused on psychological evaluation, bias detection, and field training. Their approach was pragmatic, not emotional. They knew sustainable reform had to come from within law enforcement itself, not from external pressure alone. Over time, the department's leadership faced consequences. The officers involved were reassigned pending disciplinary hearings, while the chief issued a formal apology to the twins and the FBI. But the story didn't fade from memory. Every time a new incident of racial profiling surfaced elsewhere, commentators referenced the case of the black FBI twins as evidence of how deeply ingrained prejudice remained. The brothers continued their work, though with a new purpose. They began leading training sessions across the country, addressing cadets, detectives, and federal recruits about bias recognition, situational awareness, and respect for civilians. Their sessions weren't lectures. They were real, raw, and deeply human. They reminded their audiences that empathy was not a weakness but a safeguard, that true law enforcement wasn't about control but understanding. Their experience had stripped away any illusion that the system was self-correcting. It required vigilance, courage, and honesty traits they hoped to instill in a new generation of officers who would one day wear the badge without repeating the same mistakes. When the twins revealed who they were, the air inside the bar changed instantly. The shock on the officers' faces was a mixture of disbelief and fear as realization sank in. They had just handcuffed federal agents, men who represented the very institution that oversaw and evaluated their department. But what followed wasn't an outburst or an angry confrontation. The twins' response was measured, calm, and deeply controlled, reflecting the kind of professionalism that came from years of training and Their composure, however, wasn't born from serenity. It was the product of experience, of knowing that anger in situations like this often got twisted into justification for further aggression. They understood what was at stake, not just their dignity, but the larger message their reaction would send about accountability, justice, and how law enforcement handled its own. They could have easily used their authority to retaliate, to demand immediate arrests or suspension of the officers involved. But instead, they chose a path that stunned everyone in the room. They calmly explained their mission, identified themselves again, and requested that a supervisor be called to the scene. Their tone never wavered. their posture remained controlled, and their faces carried the kind of restraint that came only from years of being tested in situations where emotion could cost lives. The officers, now visibly shaken, began to stammer out apologies, insisting they had no idea who the men were. The twins listened silently, saying little. They knew those words weren't really apologies, they were defenses, born out of panic and self-preservation, rather than genuine remorse. When the supervising sergeant arrived, the story began to unfold, layer by layer. The bar's patrons watched as the situation transformed from an act of control to one of embarrassment. The sergeant's face paled as he verified the twins' credentials, immediately realizing the magnitude of the mistake. He dismissed the officers to the side, but the twins stopped him, insisting the discussion remain open and visible to everyone present. Transparency, they believed, was the only way to confront prejudice, not behind closed doors where excuses could be made, but in the light where truth could not be twisted. They wanted every person in that bar to witness how accountability should look when authority was misused. Their calm response did something remarkable. It forced everyone in the room, including the officers, to confront their own biases without violence, without chaos. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was reflective. The crowd began to realize what had just happened wasn't an isolated mistake, but a microcosm of a national issue. It revealed how even those sworn to uphold the law could fall prey to the same prejudices they were trained to resist. The twins had lived through countless debriefings on de-escalation, but this moment was different. It wasn't theoretical. It was personal, raw, and real. Their professionalism turned what could have been another tragic confrontation into a powerful lesson about restraint and the strength it takes to respond to injustice with integrity. The story spread quickly after that night, making headlines across the country. The images of the two brothers, standing calmly while being uncuffed by embarrassed officers, became symbols of dignity under pressure. News outlets replayed the video repeatedly, commentators praising the twins for their restraint. They could have turned the situation into a spectacle of anger, but instead, they chose to expose the system's flaws through composure. That choice carried weight far beyond the bar. It challenged the narrative that change required confrontation. It showed that sometimes, silence and grace could be louder than outrage. The FBI issued a statement acknowledging the incident, emphasizing the professionalism of its agents and their commitment to justice. The local police department released an apology, though its tone was cautious and bureaucratic. Yet the twins didn't seek revenge or public humiliation for those involved. Their focus was on transformation, using the incident as a springboard for reform in the weeks that followed. The twins met with law enforcement leaders across the state, not as victims but as advocates for better training and understanding. They emphasized that bias was not just a moral failing but a tactical one. When officers let prejudice guide their decisions, they compromised safety, judgment, and community trust. Their message resonated deeply, especially among younger officers who had grown disillusioned with the old culture of denial and silence within their departments. The twins shared their experience candidly, not to shame but to educate. They explained how professionalism didn't mean suppressing emotion but channeling it, turning moments of injustice into catalysts for reflection and growth. Their story became a case study for law enforcement academies, where recruits were taught not just about the dangers of bias, but about the power of composure and accountability in moments of tension. Their calm reaction also ignited conversations beyond policing. Civil rights advocates, educators, and psychologists analyzed the event as an example of emotional intelligence in the face of systemic prejudice. It demonstrated how true power often lies not in domination but in discipline, the ability to choose the higher ground, even when provoked. The twins' decision to handle the situation without retaliation reflected a deep, upward understanding of how public perception could shape narratives. They knew that anger, however justified, could be used against them. Instead, they crafted a response that left no room for distortion. Their dignity became their defense, their silence became their statement, and their professionalism became a mirror, reflecting everything that was wrong with the way law enforcement viewed black men inside the FBI. Their actions were praised as exemplary conduct under pressure. But for the twins, it wasn't about recognition, it was about truth. They knew that every black officer who wore the badge carried a double burden: to serve the public faithfully while constantly proving their legitimacy within a system that sometimes doubted their very presence. Their experience had laid bare that contradiction for the world to see. It wasn't just about one night or one mistake. It was about the enduring reality that even those inside the system weren't immune to the bias it produced. The twins used their platform to speak openly about that internal conflict, urging agencies to not only reform external policies, but to look inward at their own cultures, hierarchies, and prejudices that silently perpetuated inequality. As the public conversation evolved, the twins' story became emblematic of a larger awakening. Across the country, departments began reevaluating how they handled incidents involving bias. Training modules were rewritten to include empathy exercises, implicit bias assessments, and real-world scenarios modeled after the bar incident. The twins were invited to contribute to these programs, offering first-hand insights into how quickly perception could cloud professionalism. Their testimony carried the weight of lived experience, and their words were impossible to dismiss. They explained that accountability wasn't about punishment alone, it was about awareness, the courage to admit fault, and the willingness to rebuild trust from the ground up. Their story humanized the debate, cutting through the political noise with the undeniable truth of what they had endured in time. The image of the two handcuffed brothers standing quietly before their stunned captors became iconic. It symbolized both the failure and the possibility of American law enforcement, the failure of prejudice and the possibility of redemption through integrity. The twins continued their work quietly, mentoring younger agents, teaching restraint, and reminding them that authority meant nothing without humanity. Their experience had shown them that justice wasn't just a principle written in law. It was a practice tested in moments of injustice. By choosing calm over chaos, they had turned humiliation into a lesson, prejudice into perspective, and silence into a form of power that resonated far beyond that bar. Their story became a living reminder that accountability begins not when mistakes are punished, but when they are acknowledged with honesty and faced with courage.